And then I wish all women a happy International Women's Day, and also to all the allies that we have had over the years who have been supporting the emancipation of women in diverse ways. So the link between climate and gender is that in our world, there's nothing that has no gender implication. And climate change itself is no exception of that. If you look at the weather and the climatic conditions that we used to have in our rural areas and then sometimes in our urban centers, it has affected how things are done now and how things used to be. So for instance, we'll talk about issues around women going to fetch firewood, going to fetch water, and how the climatic conditions affect women on same, women in agriculture, and access to irrigation, and how that is also affecting the work that they are doing on their various farms in diverse ways as well. Then we can also look at even in urban centers, what does it mean when it is raining, when it's not supposed to be, and the implications for all of us, and then trying to do a gendered analysis of those implications that we are talking about as well. So there's a lot of linkages, and when we solve those issues, we end up solving most of the bigger challenges that especially women who are more vulnerable tend to face.
And we are talking about some of the peculiar things that need to be acted on now to help women fight climate change. What are some of those things? You've mentioned how women are the ones who take care of maybe fetching of firewood and whatnot, but what actions are needed immediately?
I think the actions vary in different forms. So we can talk about issues around childcare and child responsibility. We can talk about government responding to climate change issues and what policies are in place now to respond to that. And what inputs, what are the things that we have put in place at those levels to respond to those challenges that, as it were, women will be facing in the community level. Now, there are a lot of diversity that people are talking about. We are talking about people not using firewood again and then turning to gas, but then we are talking about access and affordability. We are talking about people not felling trees and then burning for charcoal. What other options and what are the affordability means when we want to discuss about it? We are talking about water being readily available. So if I used to fetch water from 2 kilometers, has the climate affected that? And if it has, how do we respond to that in that regard? We are talking about irrigation. So if there is irrigation going on and there are opportunities, are women adequately catered for within that, or we leave it to the decision of opinion leaders who are more likely to choose men to be the beneficiaries of such interventions that comes along?
Why is it important for women, especially from our parts of the world, women in Africa, to be involved or for their voices to be heard in this climate activism agenda? And how can we get more women involved?
Well, it is not about being important, because in the end, women are human beings and whatever happens affects them. So it is the right thing to do that we call everybody to the table and then respond to the challenges and the issues that affect all of us. So, and then also, if you look at it, women are the most affected. So why would you take decisions without them? How do you listen to how it affects them in diverse ways? How do you listen to them giving you the solutions so that you don't bring a wholesale approach that does not work and then you come back to tell us that you tried, but then they didn't appreciate the efforts in place? Meanwhile, you could have included them and they would have probably given you a better solution at a cheaper cost than what you actually decided to put across for them. Then if in Africa here, how do you take decisions without the women who are the most affected? You know, it's difficult. So everyone has a role to play, and we have to create opportunities, you know, for everyone to be part of that decision-making processes as well.
We're also talking about International Women's Day at a time when at least for us in this country, individual perceptions on gender equality and gender roles are strongly influenced by cultural practices and norms. Is there a path for women towards achieving equal rights as we all want for women in Ghana?
There is a need to change mindset. One, beyond putting laws and policies in place, what are we doing to ensure that people actually change the ways they see women? Beyond women being helpers and women just being the ones responsible for reproductive roles, to seeing them more as people who also have a role to play productively, and that women can be more than how we see them. One, we need to put in place systems and structures that are really gender responsive and protect women, whether laws, whether policies, whether structures, whether interventions, whatever it is. It should be with the voices of women throughout the beginning of the processes to the end of that process as well.
We're talking about making women's voices heard. On the floor of Parliament, we're told that only about 40% of the numbers are females. How do we get more women involved, and how do we get more women into decision-making roles where their voices can matter?
I think one of that is we have been talking about the passage of the Affirmative Action Bill, which is still lying in Parliament several years after it was drafted. It has gone through several changes, but it's still yet to be passed. And we've had promises from former presidents and speakers of Parliament. Affirmative action does not only allow us to increase the numbers of women, it allows us to also break the biases and the barriers and to change how things are done. So we are talking about having a low number of women, but are political parties sensitive enough to even accept some of the things that we are talking about, like leaving safe seats for women, like supporting women by reducing the cost of nomination or filing fees, supporting women with resources so that they are better able to campaign, to get more money and be able to go around like the other people do. All these are challenges that women face. So when it comes to leadership in Parliament and all of that, it's something that all of us we have a role to play. But in the end, the passage of the Affirmative Action Bill is going to play a critical role in that.
The UN recommends 30%. The African Union represents 40% of women being actively involved in local participation. You've just mentioned lowering the financial thresholds so that more women can access. But then the question arises, if we call for women empowerment and we call for equality, why should men and women not pay the same fees to access the same opportunities?
It's about who has been disadvantaged from time immemorial. So we are not talking about being at the same level. We are talking about giving opportunities to a group of people who have been disadvantaged for a very long time. So talking about access and control to land, for instance, talking about access to education, talking about how women have been seen over time, and even now, how people see women as not people who are not supposed to be leaders. That is what we are discussing, So it has nothing to do with reducing or lowering the bar for women. That is why affirmative action is also a positive discrimination, because people source for funding for political party purposes, and that funding is always not readily available. So if people who are giving the funding are not people who support women's empowerment, how would they give the money to women to also go around to campaign? Because political parties are not giving any support in terms of cash to their constituency or the aspiring MPs.
Today, COVID-19 is front and center of our health battle across the world, and indeed, women are disproportionately impacted by COVID-19. How do we begin to integrate issues affecting women into the existing COVID-19 responses? Because we know of instances where children are not able to go to school, and it is usually women who have to stay home or make arrangements to ensure that the children are taken care of, as is the case for the elderly in society.
Well, I think it is even better now. But when COVID struck, the president never for once mentioned women or any containment measure that was responsive to women in any way at all, in all the addresses that he gave. Beyond that, when schools were closed, there was no arrangement in terms of how children will be taken care of. When partial lockdown was given, there was no arrangement as to how employers will go about taking that from the leave of workers, of which women were part of. After that, children were still at home, and there were no practical arrangements and support from any policy person or government or anyone in leadership to say that this is how we are supporting women to go back to work whilst their children are catered for in their house. But children stayed at home for 8 months, and what it meant was that some women had to resign from their jobs to sit home and take care of those children, because those responsibilities traditionally and culturally have been given to women.
How can these be remedied, Bashiru, before we take leave of you?
I think all of us have a role to play. The media, as we are discussing International Women's Day and if matters arising, it's an educating thing we are doing. Sensitization. NGOs and CSOs are already doing a lot of work. Then we need policy and legislative changes where necessary to push for some of these things to change. We need to put systems and structures in place that are very responsive on the issues of gender, and especially in terms of protecting women's right to work and then right to earn a decent living whilst working as well. Then we need to pass the affirmative action bill as well.
Thank you so much, Bashira, for spending a part of your international celebration with us this afternoon.